Okay. Our next speaker is one of the co-founders of the national engineering powerhouse known as Wallbridge Gilbert Aztec, WGA. Hands up if you're from that company. I think there's a great turnout today. Thank you. Thanks for your support. Being a structural engineer and running his own engineering company has been an enjoyable side hobby for this next speaker. It allows him to relax while he's not working hard at Australiana Publications and their team of volunteers at the State Library, and they publish history books about the history of South Australia, which is very relevant to what we're talking about today. In our previous talk, we learned about the engineers who built the City of Adelaide. Well, you're about to meet an engineer who saved the City of Adelaide. As we will soon learn, this City of Adelaide is the name of the oldest surviving clipper ship in Australia, and the story about its rescue shows the types of wonders that engineering heritage can perform. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm pleased to introduce the Order of Australia Medal winner, Mark Gilbert.
Well, that's a good intro. So this won't go by itself, will it?
No, just use the arrow, the right arrow there.
Okay. Thank you. So what we're going to do today, I'm going to tell you a little bit about the history of the ship. This could take a long time, so I've got to keep it short.
Extra time, so.
Oh, right.
Let's do it.
Yeah, but I'm conscious of that harp sound that's going to come. Then I'm going to show you a film of how we rescued it from Scotland, and it's already got a mind of its own here.
Might be on auto.
Yeah, I think it's on auto.
Because we do have time for this, so let me just have a go.
That's the
Yeah.
That could have been the cause.
So we're going to talk about, I'll just give you a little bit of background about the ship. It is the oldest clipper ship, composite clipper ship in the world, which means it's got a timber hull and an iron frame. Quite unusual transition between timber ships and iron ships. And it's a sailing ship, so it's in a transition towards steam as well.
Okay, sorry guys, just for a second, I'm going to duck out and I'm going to...
And for that reason, it had a short sort of working life, but it then went on to different phases in its life, and it languished in Scotland for a long time, and that's when we had the opportunity to rescue it. We might just see, are we up to, on track?
Yeah, that should have fixed it. I took the time off.
So is that the first one? Yeah, so it was specifically built as a passenger ship, bring passengers to South Australia, which explains its name. There are only two surviving. We're the older one of the composite variety. The other one's the Cutty Sark, which you would have heard of in Greenwich. And it was destined for destruction in 2014. And we managed to rescue it, just a group of volunteers who got together and wanted to save it. And it is one of the most 12 historic ships in the world. The Cutty Sark, the Vassar, the Victory, the Mary Rose. We're in that company. We're at the end of the list, but we're in it. So in the old days, this is what Port Adelaide would have looked like. Sailing ships were everywhere. There's the next shot is a picture of the City of Adelaide, actually at Port Augusta, picking up, I think, copper, ready to take it back to England. When we found it, it was languishing on a slipway in Irvine, which is near Glasgow, and it's a long story how it got there, but basically the Scottish Maritime Museum had it there and were able to do nothing with it, and they were going to destroy it. They're going to break it up, preserve parts of it, historically record how it was all put together. That was going to cost a lot of money, but basically destroy it. So they called for tenders for the demolition of the ship, and we tendered for this job, and we said we'll demolish it and remove it in one piece. And we knew they had a budget of £750,000 to do all that recording and preserving of the bow and the stern and whatever they were going to do. So we said we'll remove it in one piece for £750,000. And we were successful. To cut a long story short, that's what it looked like originally. And this is what it could look like. That's what happened to the Cutty Sark, but it did cost more than £50 million. And they let an architect loose on it, so it's actually suspended over a graving dock with arches that go through the hull of the ship, and they've hidden cunningly a sort of steel structure inside the ship, which a lot of the purists really disapprove of, and it probably doubled the budget. But they do have magnificent dinners directly under the ship with a long table. They have 300 people to dinner underneath and raise money, presumably. We're not going to do that. It basically did one round trip a year, came out to Australia, went back. At one time it held the record, which I think was maybe not on that list, but it was, I think, 57 days from London to Adelaide. And it held the record jointly with another ship. But generally it was more like 90 days, and it was pretty tough actually on board. The other side of this is the social side, the social history side. Experts have worked out that there are about 250,000 people alive now who can trace some lineage back to coming out on that ship, and including some famous people that are listed there. There's even one person in this in this room that I know of. So our vision, I can't dwell too long on these things, but is basically to preserve the ship, not to restore it. That would be too ambitious for a group of volunteers with no money and basically very little government support. We don't have the same appreciation of maritime heritage that they do in the UK have, for example. It's just one of those things. So it's been a little bit of a battle, but we're going to preserve it, so hold it level and hopefully improve it. Restore parts of the ship, and I'll show you a few pieces of that, a few examples. We're going to display it, now we know that we're going to display it at Dock 2 at Port Adelaide, and it will be the centrepiece of a maritime heritage precinct, which the government announced proudly, but actually left it to us to work out what it would do, how to pay for it, how to make it, and what it would look like. Took the credit, of course, as usual. But to be honest, they did give us the land. So I don't know if you can work this out, but there are the two opening bridges. Township of Port Adelaide's across that way, and this is Dock 2. It's not the best site, not the one we would have chosen, but it was the one that was offered. The others were sold off for lots of profit. So this is 3.5 hectares of land facing, this is Dock 2 and Dock 1, which is got housing development around it now, is the next dock along. And we've basically got foot on the entire site of 3.5 hectares, which has taken us 10 years to do because we brought this ship back in 10 years' time. And this is a very aspirational drawing. It's got 2 big sheds on it. We're going to house the ship here, and we'll have what we call a seaport village, which is a maritime version of Sovereign Hill, if you like, something for the families to visit, a tourism attraction, as well as a ship. And it will have a maritime heritage theme, so it'll be like a 19th century dockyard. The length, the size of the ship, it's actually, when you get close to it, I hope a lot of you have seen the ship, and if you haven't, this might inspire you to go and see it. You can see it any day of the week at Dock 2. It's as big as a jumbo jet. It's 55 metres, 60 metres long. That 244 feet includes the bowsprit. It's 10 metres wide. It's got a draft of 19 feet. it had some beautiful, and this sketch is the diagram of the first class cabins in the poop deck. In a sort of semicircle horseshoe. A number of first class cabins which were quite luxurious for the time. This is 1864. They each had their own toilet. On the level below, you had 270 people sharing 2 toilets and no windows, because they were roughly level with the water line. So there was quite a jump between first class and the rest, and that probably hasn't changed much. This slide shows the composite structure. It's cast iron, forged and worked by blacksmiths and so on for the shapes. But you'll see bold flaps, angles, rods, and so on, and it's made up in the same way that Brunel made railway station structures out of composite sections. This is very similar, and it's in that transition, as I said, between timber and iron, and it's probably got the strength of both, so it's a bit of belt and braces, which might be why it survived so well. You can see this bracing here, flat straps about this wide, running around the hull and through the decks. So I'm sure that when they put the steel iron structure up, it stood up perfectly stable and strong in its own right. Then they bolted on the skin of the hull, 5-inch thick timbers, and it would have added further strength. So it's actually massively strong. And although it's got some corrosion now, it's still very sound. There's a more technical drawing. It's for the structural engineers. A double portal. Connected, so it's great strength. Yeah, for ballast, just for ballast. Not much of that left, and I think it had the extra disadvantage that it, you know, how concrete, which we all hate, cracks, water gets into all the cracks. Most of the corrosion that you see is around where that concrete was, and probably because the water just couldn't get out and was encouraged to corrode the iron. Iron generally is resistant to corrosion, but there's a lot of corrosion right down in the keel. And that's, if anyone's inspired, that would be a great research project, because we know that we've got salts in the iron, in the, you know, in the pores of the iron, and you need to leach it out. And Captain Cook's anchor, which was recovered after 200 years on the seabed, they had to put it into a bath of some chemical liquid and leach it out, and I think they left it in there for 7 years. So we've got to find a simpler method for this. Not sure how urgent it is. The saloon where the first class cabins were, I'm showing that because we're currently recreating 2 of those cabins, and that's something we're very proud of. How did I get involved? Well, I got roped in by a guy called Richard Smith that some of you will know, because my background was heavy lifting and heavy haulage. I've been working in Scotland on oil projects like this with cranes and multi-wheeled transporters, jacking and skidding and all the things that we've used with the ship. So they said to me, look, it's on a slipway in Scotland. We don't know how to get it back, but can you see a way? So from that point on, I think I was hooked. They tempted me, and I was hooked, and that was 20 years ago. And we used to meet every week at that time. Now we meet every week and plus some. So it's been a huge commitment, but I must also say it's been a lot of fun. And other jobs we did. So Aztec was the part of our business that did the heavy lifting and heavy haulage. And we were moving things around in the 80s and since. And we built a practice on it, basically. So that was I guess my reputation in that area put me in line for the job. So now we have the film. Right. That probably tells it far better than I could. And it brings us up to date. It was 10 years ago. Next February, it'll be 10 years. It's taken all this time to establish a site, get a site from the government, and to get to the point we're in now. But this is the land that we have that I talked about before. We're leasing this land, and the ship is presently here on a barge, on that barge you saw. This is what we call ship 13, and that's ship 14. So this is our site at the present. We have that, but we have the option to purchase the shed 14 land, which is a great opportunity for us. Because the whole idea is to use a principle that was developed in Bristol, or demonstrated in Bristol, with the SS Great Britain, Brunel's great steamship. They had a derelict port, they had an old ship, they didn't know what to do with it. Same problem exactly. And they decided to endow the ship with a certain amount of land and then do some development. In that case, they built a block of apartments in the style of a Brunel warehouse on the Bristol waterfront. And at the end of that, the developer made some money, and the SS Great Britain Trust had £5 million in the bank, and that kick-started them. And then it kick-started the whole of the port. Now you've got people like Microsoft and corporations all wanting to have their offices facing the water. So it actually was a catalyst to regenerate the port, and we can see a lot of parallels with this. And that's really how we persuaded the government to give us this land. That's probably all they're going to do. They've always said they've got no money, but they've got assets. So we said, well, give us the land, and if you give us enough land, we won't be a problem to you in the future, because they always felt that, you know, we'd go broke and then they'd be lumbered with another old ship. So we said, well, if you give us enough, we'll be viable. And now we have to deliver. So, yeah, we've got to convert our assets, the land and the buildings, into an income, basically. Ships don't make a profit. That probably won't come as any surprise to you guys, especially wooden ships. Our vision, the seaport village I told you about, conserve the ship, restore key aspects. It wants to be an exciting display. We want community use. We want to use that land for community use, so there'll be playgrounds, places for concerts, gatherings and so forth, maybe a market. But then there'll be some commercial aspects that basically will pay us rent. So that's the vision, that we generate an income to feed into the ship, into that bottomless pit. And needless to say, I should explain, we're a not-for-profit organisation, that no one gets paid. There are no dividends, no nothing. This is all for the love of it. You've seen that shot. That's the vision. The seaport village could look like this. This is an architect's impression. John Hales did these drawings for us. Now, the work that we've done in the past few years, 10 years, the poop deck, which is where the saloon is, where those cabins are, we've completely redecked it. And it was 76 thick Oregon. We couldn't find any 76 mil thick timbers, 150 wide. So we made it a composite sort of section. We used structural ply for the core, and then Oregon on the top to get the look, and then a matchboard on the bottom for the ceiling below. So we've sort of faked it a bit, but we've been as faithful as we could within our budget, because you can imagine that took us 2 years, and we did it with voluntary labour. And Bone Timber, for example, donated the timber to us. They had a whole lot of seasoned Oregon which we could use. I mean, as you can see, the whole project has really been a community effort and really an engineering community effort. You know, we called it, we had to raise some money, of course, but we called in so many favours from town that probably people cross the street when and what we realised that when we brought the ship home, we thought, oh, well, that's great, we've achieved that, that's over. Well, that was the beginning of the next phase, and we had so much more work ahead of us, so more favours to call in. But the decking is actually a beautiful job. We've got some really skilled volunteers. That's the composite section. And now we're in the process of recreating 2 of those first-class cabins, the ones with the toilets. And once again, Spry and Spry, who are local cabinet makers, are doing the partitions for us. My own brother's been pressed into service as the architect. And these are the basic panels, but then there's decorative mouldings to go on there. So the first-class cabins were quite elaborate, and then the standard dropped as you went down below. But these were quite good. But that's 2 cabins. That's one, the toilet's in the back, and then there's 2 bunks, one over the other in there, and that's it. The whole family might be in there, but they're living the life at Riley. So this year is a huge year for us, and that's really what I want to tell you about. We're going to move the ship from the barge onto land, and that's a massive engineering job. It's expensive and so on. The work that we did to bring the ship back could be valued at least $5 million in street dollars, if you like. And we did that by raising money, got that government money that I told you about, and then we called in favours, and so we got gifts in kind from the industry, and that's how we managed to achieve it. And once again, we're doing the same thing, and I'll tell you a bit about that. We're going to house it. You saw where we're going to put it at the end of the shed, facing the river. It'll be in a shallow pit just to improve the lines of the ship when you look at it, but only set down about 1 metre. Otherwise, we'll hit the water table and get into all sorts of trouble. But for example, Bud Avcol, who are doing the work next door for the housing development, moving dirt and doing remediation and stuff, they're going to dig the pit for us for nothing, which is a huge gesture, really. We're talking to people like Hallett Concrete about concrete, other reinforcement suppliers, steel fixers and so on to help us do the foundations. The move itself will be done on SPMTs, just as you saw in the film, and this time donated or lent or made available by A&I, which is the arm of the Submarine Corporation. So that alone is worth, say, probably $250,000 to bring them from somewhere else and to use them. They're going to treat it as a training exercise, which is just brilliant for us. And that will happen this year. In order to get the trailers under it, just as you saw in the film, you've got to raise the ship up. So that we're going to move it on the cradle because that holds it all safe and stiff. The cradle has to be jacked up 1,500 millimetres on the deck of a barge, and people will understand that you can't just place a force anywhere on the deck of a barge. You've got to find the hard spots, the strong points in that barge, and match them to the strong points in the cradle that you placed over it and didn't think about exactly where you've got to put it when you planned the job. So that's quite an exercise for us, and that's going to happen next month. Then we move it, then we jack it down to its final elevation and put it on its final supports. So the jacking operation, we're using a climbing jack system that the Dutch used, but this time we're making our own. Well, another great thing that's happening is the Submarine Corporation happens to have a lot of free work or free time for their apprentices. So they've got about 70 apprentices, and they want community jobs to keep them occupied. So they're making stuff for us, which is so lucky, because we've got to make 10 of these elephant stools, I call them. They're only 450 mil high, but they house a sort of little jacking cylinder there, hydraulically operated, and they climb. And there'll be 10 of them, because we've got to lift 600 tons. And the climbing operation, just for the engineers. So you set it up here with the load on the top, and the stool is attached to the load, so it hangs from the load as you climb. And the cylinder is attached to that, so that hangs underneath. So you push down here with the ram, and you raise it, let's say 100 mil or 75 mil in this case. In Holland they use 90s, but we use 75. So you jack up the whole load and the stool 75 mil. And you put these timbers in. You put in 4 timbers, hardwood timbers under there, onto the deck, making sure the deck's strong enough for where you placed it. Then you retract the jack and you put 3 in the middle. Then you repeat the process, but you run them the other way, like a pigsty. And you climb up in 75 mil steps. It's so simple, it's embarrassing, because we tried to invent a kind of system using pins and so on, and we got very complicated. And then the Dutch said, well, why don't you do it the way we did it? But they were going to bring their jacks out and these frames, and that was going to cost us about $50,000 in freight. And then the Submarine Corporation popped up, and we had the brainwaves that we could do it. We could make our own and keep them. And they were happy to share the intellectual property. So that was a bit of luck for us. We got 1,100 pieces of timber. Finding them wasn't hard, but we were going to use formwork timbers that they use. They're 90 by 65, I think, but they're laminated, so they're machine factory made, if you like, good tolerance and so forth. That the dreaded half bill, and but they were too soft. We tested it at the uni, and the compressive strength wasn't good enough. So we had to search in a real hurry. This is about 6 weeks ago, for hardwood, and we searched the country, and the best price I got from Western Australia was $80,000 for what we needed. And I looked on Gumtree and I found a man with a shed full of hardwood timber in Port Adelaide, and it cost us, I think, $6,000 for what we needed. And it's from Malaysia. It's not an endangered species. It's related to mangrove timber. So that was another bit of luck. Oh, and I should say that the 2 Dutchmen who did the job in Scotland 10 years ago are coming out to manage this for us, and they'll be out here in a month's time, and that's really an important part of our risk management. I won't go to all of this, but we've looked at this in detail because it's quite a dangerous operation, potentially dangerous. We've got secondary supports. If one support system fails, the jacking support system fails, it'll be caught by a series of supports that follow along behind. Every jack has got a valve in it, a check valve, so that if the hydraulics fail or the hose fails, the jack locks in its position. So we think we've got it covered. We are looking for people we need 10 to 20 people to help us move the timbers on the day. So I'm looking for young, fit people, probably younger than me, and fitter than me. The timbers are about 7 kilos each, but there's so many of them. And to just stack those timbers up is quite a job. We're also putting the word out to the crane industry. We're hoping that people like riggers will support us, and we think they will. But I'm just sowing the seed if anyone's interested. Now the offload, I'll quickly go through this. Tell me, David, if I'm...
We are out of time, but I'm really reluctant to stop here. So
Well, we're nearly there. So after we jack the barge up, we have to secure it on the secondary supports, give it lateral support and so forth. We're going to clear the area under the cradle on the barge deck, and then we're going to lay a pavement. There are a lot of projections, including a whole lot of rails on the deck that are 170 mil high. So we're going to lay probably pour a weak concrete mix and make a 180 thick deck on top of the deck, like a pavement for the trailers to run on. And then a bridge unit is needed. We're going to barge is here. We're going to take it down here, and that's in a rock embankment. So we're going to ground the end of the barge, the bow of the barge, on that rock embankment, which minimises, holds it level, so that the trailers don't have a mismatch when they roll on and off. And we need, on the next slide, there's a 8-metre bridge unit we've got to make, just amongst the other things we have to do to roll over. You saw them in Scotland, they came with the barge, no such luck with us. And you can see when the load's half on, half off, people like the Submarine Corporation probably see that as a critical risk point. If all goes well, that'll be over in 5 minutes, probably less. These things move at walking pace. It won't even feel it, but we've got to do our risk analysis and have all the eventualities covered. This is the swept path. We have to go up between a shed, a Stobie pole and a railway line, back it up, shuffle round, do a sort of perfectly executed 3-point turn, and then back into the site. But these things, you can control every wheel on these things. They can spin on a nickel, they can do anything, they can go sideways. So this probably will not be difficult. The bridge unit you can see there on the end of the barge, that'll be steel. The pathway we follow, we've got to go between the two sheds into the pit, down a ramp into the pit, which is down about 1.2 metres below the surface. The trailers like to go at about 1 in 20 maximum slope. I've talked about Bud Coal. We've got to proof roll it to make sure that we've got the strength that we need. And there will be the foundations. The section will look a little bit like that. Richard Smith drew that one up for us. 3 strip footings and then 2 strip footings for the retaining walls. 150 cubic metres of concrete to pour to get for nothing from somewhere. And with thickenings, because the jacking, this is quite complex, but you've got you set it down on supports from the trailers. So that's one set of supports, one loading condition. Then you put the jacks into position. That's another loading condition. And then they set it down on the final supports, which is the third loading condition. So those pads have got 3 jobs. In the end, the final supports are along the central strip footing lines, and the loads are very low. We have to jack it down. That's the complex one, which I won't go into. What happens next? We're going to have, from the shed, we're going to have an aero bridge across so you can get into the ship at the right level, stairs and access, a ramp, ultimately a lift for disabled access. The shed, that's how it might end up. That's like a master planning document. But next year we'll start to have a cafe at one end of the shed, the ship end of the shed. And we see that as essential. And then ship projects, we want to reinstate the bowsprit and the figurehead. The figurehead was a lion and a kangaroo flanking the bowsprit, England and Australia. So that's very symbolic, and that'll be painted in gold and red and stuff. So that'll be quite a thing when we achieve it. An architectural firm you might have heard of called Baukulter offered to help us with aspects of this, and they came up with typical architect sort of solution. They said, oh, you've got a lot of scaffold. Let's make a feature of the scaffold. We'll make it an iconic image. It'll be more famous than the Rubik's Cube down at McLaren Vale. And you'll become famous. And it won't cost you a penny. So we're pretty excited about that. It's really just scaffold. It'll have to be painted and it'll have to be designed so that it's perfectly uniform and got a bit of structure to it. Our long-term plan is to build buildings in the spare land here, which might produce income. Seaport Village will be here, that's the water up there. Ship here. The other ships, the other vessels from the Maritime Museum, we're going to house as well under an agreement. So the Nelson B, possibly the Faley, the Annie Watt, and the One and All Moors alongside already, and they're happy to be cohabitants. And then we work our way towards the grand vision. As I said, we've had a lot of supporters and we're working on them. There's new ones coming all the time. I have to mention McMahon Services have been massive supporters. They've lent us so much steel from their scrapyard that it's worth an absolute fortune because there's a lot of steel needed in this jacking operation. Reiterate the call for volunteers. If you know anyone who might be interested, who has some construction site knowledge and nous, please tell us. And then if you don't want to do that, but you're interested in research projects or making stuff or even volunteering, and there are some volunteers in the audience, I know, there are other things where you could contribute. So thank you. Sorry to go over time, David. Excellent.
Thanks, Mike. Like I said, I was very reluctant to stop you there because it's just such interesting content. We will move on to our next speaker. Can I suggest we're having afternoon tea at 3:10. So if you do have questions for Mark, please don't hesitate to approach him. Be careful though, you may become a volunteer.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so let's get on.